everyone. Welcome back to the Beyond Waste podcast. I'm Young, and I'll be co-hosting this session with Addie from Gaia. You want to introduce yourself, Addie?
Thanks, Young. I'm Addie with Gaia, tuning in from New York City, and we also have Alex Danovitch here.
Great. So we're going to be talking about chemical recycling, which is a fall solution that has really picked up steam in the last couple of months. So I'm going to start with this is what the agenda is going to be today. We're going to go over what exactly chemical recycling is, what is pyrolysis, why both of them are false solutions, go over some common talking points that folks that are for chemical recycling will use, and then we're going to hear from Nothing Left to Waste, who's our community expert. So chemical recycling is also known as advanced recycling in the industry, and can also be called plastic repolymerization. It's sometimes also interchangeably called plastic to fuel or pyrolysis. And this kind of keeps it vague so that you can't really put your finger on what exactly chemical recycling is. And as I just said, it's an intentionally vague term. And this is pulled from a Greenpeace report that allows industries to refer to lots of technologies in one big umbrella of chemical recycling to both put in like bad industry tactics.
Yeah, so, some people aren't fully aware of what chemical recycling is. I personally only learned what it was like within the last year because there's not a lot, like most people do not really know what exists beyond mechanical recycling, which is the kind of recycling where you're taking a piece of post-consumer plastic and turning it into another plastic of a quality that is most often degraded after it gets recycled. But with chemical recycling or plastic repolymerization, that is looking at allegedly turning plastic into a new plastic of a similar quality to the original. And there's also a big lack of regulatory oversight. So there's little information about what the possible impacts of actually turning plastic into plastic really would be. Plastic to fuel, again, is turning plastic into a fuel that gets burned. This is picking up in a lot of areas, being masked as like a clean fuel, like in certain places they're advocating for this in like clean fuel standards. They're advocating for it to be like a green jet fuel to prop up the airline industry. So yeah, just some places to look out for plastic to fuel in the news. And again, most chemical recycling is actually just this. So why is this bad? Well, it's a distraction to the solutions that actually get at the root of the problem. There's this fascination with techno fixes that, you can throw technology at a problem without having to change any of the underlying conditions that are creating this problem. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. It's a threat to public health, particularly the health of environmental justice communities. And it's expensive and a waste of time at a time where we don't have those things to spare. So a little bit more about, how this isn't actually a thing that works. So of the dozens of chemical recycling facilities that have been proposed, just 3 are operational. None have actually done the thing that they are saying that they are doing, turning plastic into new plastic. We don't know a lot about these possible impacts. We do know, however, that heavy investments are needed to build a chemical recycling facility, between producing and preparing the feedstock, managing toxic byproducts, and looking at technical failures. Overall, they're a really risky investment, and these kinds of technologies have actually wasted at least $2 billion of investments in canceled or failed projects around the world. And chemical recycling is competing against and losing to virgin plastic production. So it's not getting at it's not actually solving the problems that it's claiming to be addressing. It's a threat to public health. So what comes in must come out. Plastic can contain thousands of chemicals, including known toxins. So these toxic substances go somewhere. So as emissions, as waste byproducts, and in the resulting product. And if these fuels and products have ever been tested for toxicity, those results are not public. Um, and yeah, over half the plastic produced in those facilities comes out as climate pollution. So that's on top of the emissions that come out from burning that resulting fuel. And at Agilex, which is one of the industry's most celebrated quote unquote chemical recycling plants, over 3 times the amount of greenhouse gases are produced for each unit of product. So yeah, that's another side about, how this is an investment that often goes down the drain. For example, there's a facility in Tigard, Oregon, owned by that company, Agilex, a demonstration facility, which received at least $25 million in private investments. But the company was forced to temporarily shut down for a while after its product didn't compete at all with the low price of oil, sending a lot of those investments down the drain. And then they also received $500,000 in public money in tax credits from the Oregon Department of Energy through their building energy tax credit program. So taking over, building energy or business energy tax credits from companies actually working in renewables, and putting them towards something that is bad for the climate and bad for our health. And they actually had to eventually abandon the plant because it was unable to overcome technical difficulties. So that was a waste of both private and public funds.
So now I'm going to go over a couple talking points, and I'm going to pull in our community expert for responding to some of these. And the idea of these is that I often find myself in arguments with people these days, right? And they have these talking points that they say that I don't always know how to respond to in like the most educational way. And so I figured that we could go through these, hear what Alex has to say in response to them, and then show a short response that we also came up with. But I would really love to hear what Alex's thoughts are. So our first one is that people can say that it's a part of the circular economy. So what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I mean, the way I usually talk about it is if it's not displacing the extraction that went into that product in the first place, it's not really circular. You know, I used to have a slide that was the earth, and then it slowly got covered with recycled plastic park benches or, Capri Sun backpacks. And it's like making this, circularity isn't about finding something to make with your end product to avoid disposing of it. It's about trying to really displace what went into that product in the first place. And so with chemical recycling, it's the question of, is it really displacing the need for extraction?
That was a really great answer. And ours is like way more technical and not as nice as that. But I really like the idea of like, do we really just need more park benches made out of plastic? And like, what's going to happen to those at one point? All right, next talking point. It can help grow economies not equipped with mechanical recycling.
Oof. I think economies not equipped with mechanical recycling are very prone to be exploited for all sorts of issues. So, I think going in and saying the lowest possible thing we can do with this material that's the most profitable for industry is not, a great approach.
Yeah, and I think like as someone who, is like, is from a quote unquote developing country, now that I'm thinking through this, I think it might also help to say that you shouldn't be sending experimental technologies with unproven health benefits, health problems and climate impacts to developing countries. There are countries who don't have access to mechanical recycling, and that is fundamentally like an abusive relationship between a country of power to a country with less power. Similarly to the way that we export waste out there, we can't be exporting these potentially dangerous technologies out there either.
All right, and the last one that we hear people saying is that it's a good short-term solution and may not be great for the long term. What's your response to that one, Alex?
This one, I mean, it's about, the investments that go into these systems are millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I don't think anyone's planning on these being short term. And once those economics are there, you have to, we say, feed the beast. Once you build it, it's going to find a feedstock for it, because that's what's going to be economically incentivized. So it's a pretty big decision.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like if it was going to be short term, it shouldn't be so expensive. If you're just going to be a band-aid.
Yeah, and I think we can also look to many of the arguments that people use around how natural gas is not a bridge fuel and like in between like dirty energy and clean energy, just like chemical recycling isn't the bridge between, our current system and zero waste.
Yeah, and as a response to all of these questions, I think that it kind of gets back to is just like, what if we just stop producing plastic instead of finding all of these expensive ways to try to get rid of it? And so that's, I think, a question that a lot of us don't really think about, if we just stop producing it. All right, now I'm going to hand it over to our community expert who definitely knows way more about this than us.
So I'm Alex Danovitch from Nothing Left to Waste, and we collaborate with municipalities and nonprofits and institutions to look at their infrastructure and move, try to change the systems that are perpetuating waste in the first place. So we're working with a nonprofit in Ann Arbor, Michigan called Recycle Ann Arbor that's building a new recycling facility and has a contract with the city to collect material and process material. And then I work with a lot of smaller municipalities and cities to try to advocate for zero waste policies and work to really try to build local supply chains that are more transparent and accountable as an alternative to the current corporate driven model. Most of my background is with Eureka Recycling, where I was at for 15 years, and I'm still a board member. And they're a nonprofit, known call themselves a zero waste lab, but have a recycling facility and collection fleet and contracts with the city of St. Paul and Minneapolis in Minnesota. So I come back from, I have a lot of operational background, but have moved more towards the policy end. And I think, to us, the chemical recycling issue is really about solidifying this greenwashing narrative on single-use plastics that's been going on for 20 years. When I first got into recycling, to the predecessor of Eureka Recycling, we actually weren't even collecting 1 and 2 plastic bottles. We had drop-offs for them because we felt like if we made it too convenient for people, that would give them the signal that they could continue buying plastic bottles. This was in 1997, I guess. And there's this big push at the time. And we were one of the last major cities in the country to actually add plastics. And eventually we had to add it because there was no alternative. You couldn't tell people with a straight face that they should just avoid buying a plastic bottle. And B, because the reality was that material, if we weren't recycling it, is even though it was being downcycled into things that it was very little bottle to bottle recycling at that point, and there's still very little. But even that is better than going to an incinerator where it's got a whole slew of environmental justice issues. So we always kind of emphasize domestic markets and only collected material that we had multiple redundant domestic markets for. But the narrative from the industry and the predominance across the country was really to move to 1 through 7 collection. And that was driven by the industry saying it's too hard for people to know which plastics is recyclable. And these emerging markets are coming and eventually it'll all be recycled. So it's that's what's led us to today, where we have this crisis of all this plastic that's been going into our recycling stream and no markets for a lot of it. And as people are hearing that message through all these like great documentaries and work that's happening to really visualize this, and partially driven by the export bans that are forcing us to actually deal with our recycling here in the US, it's become more transparent that there aren't markets for these plastics, and that has the industry freaked out, because the last thing they want to do is not make a plastic bottle, as I'm sure everyone on here knows. So I'll tell you what's happening in Pennsylvania. There's a chemical recycling bill. It's an advanced recycling bill, HB 1808, and it already passed the House by a huge majority, and it is Republican majority House and Senate. But the problem is, in the House, this is such an issue that's so misunderstood, and there's such a desperation for people to actually have a easy recycling fix, that the majority of Democrats actually, and progressive, and people that had environmental history, voted for this bill in the House, just because of the way it was worded and how it was framed is really misleading. So it's an indication of what a tough battle this is. And what this bill did was basically define advanced recycling, including pyrolysis and gasification, as it defined it as advanced recycling. And the impact of this is it moves those types of operations away from solid waste regulation and into manufacturing regulation, and opens the door for renewable energy credits. But I think the biggest harm is just, even in the name itself, it legitimizes these false solutions. And already, we're seeing 3 proposals that are going to build off this false solution. There's a pyrolysis plant that's proposed in Berks County that's going to make plastics into jet fuel. The next 2, I don't even know if they technically qualify as advanced recycling, but they're absolutely plastics to energy. And it's being legitimized by this whole process. One is there's going to be a huge sorting facility. It's like 300,000 tons of plastics a year, where they're going to take mixed plastic from all these communities across the country and sort out, the 1s and 2s and 5s that have, at least something to be made into, although I wouldn't call it circular. And the rest of it, they have an agreement with a iron furnace where it's going to displace coke and so it's going to. So all the recycling programs across the country say, oh, we have a market in Erie, and Erie is just pulling out most of that plastic and burning it in furnaces, which is obviously a false solution. In Philadelphia, it's been going on at least 3 or 4 years now. The MRF, where all the recycling is sorted, takes all the residual and sends it to be burnt in cement kilns in Lehigh Valley. And they call it spec fuel, and they actually process it into this light dust. I have a great picture of someone at Waste Management holding it in their hand proudly. And, they're like, it displaces, all the things you need to burn in cement kiln, but obviously it's a horrible justice issue. And we're scared that chemical recycling and advanced recycling is going to, move this material from residual to actually recycled. Now it's like, why call it residual if we've legitimized plastics to energy? So that's a huge threat in terms of, taking the pressure off of finding a real solution. So next thing I just want to talk about, a couple other things that kind of fit into the landscape is, the American Chemistry Council, who wrote the legislation for HB 1808, also, or I shouldn't say wrote it completely, but contributed heavily, I assume, also has a collection pilot happening in Pennsylvania, where they're collecting flexible packaging plastics with single stream and sorting it out. And they've pretty much proven that they can do it technological wise. You could put flexible packaging in single stream. It costs about $5 million per facility to actually implement this. And I did the numbers on Philadelphia alone. That would cost about $225,000 a year just to collect a little bit of flexible packaging that made it into the recycling bin. So it's a model that, again, transfers the cost to the residents, but then at the end of this pilot that they've called successful because they can collect it, there's still nothing to do with the material. So it goes back to this chemical recycling, is they need an outlet where they can actually send it at the end of the day, because mechanically it's really hard to use that low value material. That's a lot of different resins mixed together. And then kind of the final thing that's really hurting Pennsylvania is there's a preemption that ban on bans. You can't have any cities that have a ban on any single-use plastics. It was supposed to be for 1 year, and they just extended it to be 6 months beyond the end of the COVID declaration of emergency, which, you know, who knows how long that'll go on for. So they're using COVID as a way. So they're banning the ability to actually reduce plastics, creating a really expensive way that'll pass the cost to the community to collect it, and then creating this definition of advanced recycling to legitimize plastics to fuel, so that they can claim they have an end market for it. So it's a really scary time. And I was just in a community meeting last night where they were trying to decide whether to go join into this pilot to collect flexible packaging at the curb or push for a bag ban. You know, and it was literally like that fork in the road that I think this community, you know, and I think they're leaning towards bag ban and not participating, but it's, you know, it's that fork in the road is extreme. And like we talked about, it's not a short-term solution. Likely once residents are used to putting it in their recycling, it could do that for the long term. So it's really impacting our work in terms of trying to find, you know, ways to reduce plastics. It's legitimizing single use. And I think when recycling works, you know, it has these impacts, and there's certain things that make sense in recycling, and there's things that don't make sense to be dealt with in the recycling stream. It's more about how do we change the design of it or change the system so that it's not created in the first place.
What caused you to go from working in like the back end of things, like at Eureka or at a recycling plant, to like move into policy work?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what was driving me to even be in operations in the first place was this lack of transparency that existed in this, you know, as you're experiencing and constantly having to make these compromises to try to make recycling work. You know, what was really driving us was like, how do you connect that to the behavior change, right? And so it's like, if it's not transparent, how can you actually get that to have people either changing the behavior or pushing for policy and supporting those policies? So that's sort of what led me to, you know, just having that information. I thought it was something I could contribute on the policy side and in advocacy work with communities.
You know, Alex, I did have one question for you about what proposals around chemical recycling are looking like in PA. What kind of arguments are being put forth to the communities where those plants are being cited at? Because, like, yeah, I'm just curious about how these are being pitched and what does intervention there currently look like? Because Gaia's, you know, we're trying to make materials, but we're not on the ground. So I'd love to know what organizing is happening.
Yeah. So, I mean, right now, most of the organizing is around trying to stop the bill from passing the Senate, which is going to be really difficult. And it's going to be it passed out of the Senate committee already. So it should hit the floor like in the next week or two. And Penn Environment has been taking a really good lead on, they have a sign-on letter and have been, you know, getting the word out to call your senators and vote no. You know, the senators I've contacted were like super grateful. I sent them the Gaia report and they were like, I had no idea this was a bad bill, which is like, again, the scariest part of it is, right, the people that you're counting on to hold those good votes on, you know, and if enough senators vote against it, there's the possibility the governor could veto it, but I think it's a long shot. So beyond that, I think, you know, my strategy is to get these communities not to buy into chemical recycling and hold steady and try to, you know, ban plastics and take other actions instead of, you know, even if the recycler accepts the material, I think we're going to have to work hard to try to cut off that supply so that, you know, these industry aren't able to be economically viable, which is already dicey to begin with, as you pointed out. So there's that. It's a hard battle because Pennsylvania is also like a huge extraction state with tons of fracking, and that's where these bills are coming from, is these communities. We have a huge cracker plant that's being built outside of Pittsburgh, and so there's a lot of people that are economically tied to the success of extraction to begin with that are supporting this, and it's all tied together. So I think, we're just trying to, I think the best thing at this moment is to educate people that it's not the solution that it's being portrayed as, and it's not recycling, even though they're calling it recycling. And, none of these, I think that, the waste management spec fuel facility is operating and still operating as far as I know. But everything else is still just in the proposal stage. So I think, if the legislation doesn't pass, that's the single greatest thing you could do, because I think it's unlikely, that makes it, having the regulation makes people more comfortable making these investments if they know the regulatory climate supports that kind of work. But the communities they're going in, they're pitching it as jobs, and they're pitching it as an environmental benefit, but mostly jobs.
Yeah, interesting. So it's partially a matter of going in and trying to inoculate communities before those arguments come up.
Yeah. I also live in Pennsylvania. I live in Pittsburgh.
You're really
I know about preemption, and I think that's like stopped a lot of folks from starting to organize because they're like, it's pointless. Like, what do we do about preemption?
Yeah, preemption is crazy. Like, and it's a strategy that's coming in more and more states, and so New Jersey just did a great job, right, banning, which is right next to, at least where I'm, my part of Pennsylvania. And so right over the border, an entire state can ban plastic bags, but a little community, 10 miles away doesn't have the legal authority. I think we have to find some communities that are willing to stand up against the government and challenge it. I mean, Philadelphia has passed a ban that's going to go in, but they've now tied to the going into effect when the state allows it. There's, I think, 2 other cities, Westchester and somewhere else, that also have done similar things. So I think if we could find bold communities that are willing to push against the state, I think it would be really bad press for like the state to be saying, you're not allowed to do something to protect your community, and to force them to really have to address that issue.
Thanks for listening. That was the end of part 2 of our Fall Solution series. Make sure to tune in next time for part 3 about recycling.